Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 70 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Calgary Flames, in which the Sharks have lost 4-2. So it was the fourth and final game against the Calgary Flames this season. The Flames, of course, the top team in the Pacific Division, one of the better teams in the Western Conference, and yet the Sharks came in with a 3-0 season series lead against Calgary, and were looking to complete the season series sweep. Unfortunately, it would not end up being in the cards, though the Sharks did put up an admirable performance, I would say, here tonight. They certainly didn't get destroyed by the Pacific Division's top team. In fact, this one, while it did start off with a Calgary Flames goal coming from Tkachuk to make it 1-0, it would then be rather quickly tied up with a Nick Bonino goal to make it 1-1. The Flames would manage to get another goal in the first period to make it 2-1, and that would be the score heading into the first intermission, but all in all, not the worst possible first period for the Sharks. I would say they were outplayed, certainly, but they definitely did still get their chances and managed to score the one goal. In the second period, however, Calgary managed to extend that lead. It was a relatively even start to the second period, though I will say in the latter half of it, Calgary seemed to have more control, besides maybe the last minute or two of the second period, where the Sharks came back with two very strong shifts, in particular from their top line of Barabanov, Hertl, and Meyer. And yet the Sharks were still trailing by 2 at the end of the second period. It should be noted, however, in the previous matchup between these two teams, the Sharks were trailing 3-1 in that one as well, and then managed to actually end up winning it. And so the Sharks definitely were not out of it, and they would actually manage to score the next goal of this game. Logan Couture would make it 3-2 Calgary, but unfortunately, once the goaltender got pulled, the Sharks, they had some zone time at the very least. It wasn't disastrous like some of their goaltending pulled 6-on-5 situations have been as of late, but still, in the end, a small missed pass, a good defensive play from a Flames player leads to a sort of rush, I guess, the other way. Tkachuk is able to deke out Sharks players who obviously are having to commit very fully to trying to take the puck away on an empty net type of situation, and Lindholm puts it away with the 4-2 victory for the Flames. On to the players to talk about. It is once again the Sharks' first line that is leading away, far and away the Sharks' best line here tonight, generating most of the high danger chances for San Jose, and while they didn't actually manage to score a goal, as the Couture one came just at the tail end of a power play, and of course the Bonino one involves the Sharks' third line, they still did generate many of the Sharks' good chances, like I mentioned, and so not really much to harp on here because it's something that I've said so many times in the past. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, I know hopes could be somewhat high for this second line just based on how they played in the previous game against the Oilers, but Chmelevski, Couture, and Gregor kind of came out with the short end of the stick here tonight, not really doing much of anything in this game, and I think that is an important clarification to make when it comes to this second line, because when you're playing, Couture, obviously strong enough second line player, but when you're playing with Chmelevski, very new to the NHL, and Gregor isn't really a second line player, it's much more so a line that when you get a game like against the Oilers, you're in a pleasantly surprised type situation, and then when you end up with a game against a Flames team and you don't look particularly well, it's not necessarily super disappointing because it's kind of expected in that way. Yes, you obviously could sit here and hope, well, Chmelevski, maybe he is a top 6 player, but it's just not realistic at this point in time. And so when you're going up against a team that is also especially as good as the Calgary Flames are, the second line isn't really expected to do all that much, and that was indeed the case here tonight. There was this one good chance that Chmelevski had very early on in this game, I would say, but besides that, this line didn't really get a lot done, and like I said, that's not that much of a surprise, even though the general messaging from the Sharks earlier today with all the news that happened surrounding Doug Wilson is that this team is looking to win now and be competitive. When you actually take a look at the lineup and look at this second line of Chmelevski, Couture, and Gregor, it doesn't necessarily inspire a lot of hope that this team is going to be competitive at any point, unless major changes were to actually happen in this upcoming offseason. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, like I mentioned, this was the line that actually scored a goal at even strength, because I don't really count Couture's goal at even strength because I believe it just came right at the end of the power play. Even if it was with like a second left on the power play, that doesn't particularly matter much anyway. But when it comes to Bonino, Nieto, and Balcers, they actually combined very well for this first goal. I was actually surprised about some decently nice passes and a good rush into the zone on that particular Bonino goal. Past that, it wasn't anything amazing, but I should note that obviously in the middle part of the season, from like game 30 to game 55 or something like that, at least everything prior to the Cogliano trade, it should be noted that the Sharks' third line was consistently very bad, with the trio of Bonino, Cogliano, Nieto being together for most every single game. And so the fact that this lineup right now, for the past few games where Bonino has been with a couple of different players, and tonight it's with Nieto and Balcers, the fact that that line has been still decent and has just been not completely terrible is actually a vast improvement from where it was previously. So actually not a terrible night when you consider those factors. When it comes to the fourth line, here is where we have a bit of an issue, because obviously, Jeff Viel, he's had a couple of good games this season, but he's mostly been pretty useless and yet still finds his way into the lineup. Scott Reedy has had some decent looks as well, though I wouldn't say he's necessarily super ready to be a consistent NHL player even on the fourth line. But the major issue that I draw here is with Jonathan Dahlin, and that's not necessarily my issue is not necessarily that he's playing on the fourth line, is that he's just kind of in this limbo type of situation at this point. If you're playing him on the fourth line or even on the third line, he is a player who's not able to drive his own line, and you're playing him with two very, not unskilled, that's a bit unfair to say, but two players that aren't necessarily all that great offensively, like Viel, like Reedy, and so you're not really expecting Dahlin to produce all that much. Like, I'm not entirely sure what you could expect Dahlin to do in a particular situation like that. And yet when you put Dahlin onto, let's say, the second line with Couture, he hasn't really been performing. And so at this point, Dahlin is in a situation where he doesn't really fit anywhere in the Sharks lineup. He's not good enough to be in the top six, and he's not really going to accomplish anything in your bottom six either. And so right now it's like a situation where, let's say you were to decide between Gadjevich, I know of course he is injured, or Dahlin, you're kind of ending up with extremely similar results playing either of them. The major difference, I guess, would be the fact that Dahlin does play the second power play unit for the Sharks, and I will say he had a couple of decent looks on that second power play unit, so maybe he's still worth playing, kind of like how when the Sharks earlier on were playing Kevin Labanc consistently in the bottom six for the San Jose Sharks, but he'd still managed to make his way onto the power play. He could be that type of power play specialist on the second power play unit who plays in the bottom six currently, so I guess in that vein, he is still a better option than Gadjevich, but it's just a very awkward situation all around, and I don't know if he has the ability. I don't know off the top of my head if he actually has the ability to be sent down to the AHL, but that might actually be the best possible move for him going into these last few games of the season, because I just don't know how much he actually gets accomplished over these last 12 games that the Sharks do have, where, half the time he'll find himself probably on the third or usually even the fourth line, and half the time he'll find himself in the press box. It's just kind of a weird situation, and I feel like he needs a full refresh going into the next season. On to the defensemen. Once again, Burns and Megna are leading the way, and I just continue to be very surprised about this mini resurgence that Brent Burns has had at the end of this season. It's been much more difficult to actually point out that many of Brent Burns' mistakes. Obviously still a couple, but even when he was a Norris Trophy winner back in the 16-17 season, he still had a couple of those defensive mistakes. But when you compare it earlier on to where Brent Burns, he couldn't go a shift without making a terrible defensive move or just getting completely lost in his own zone, Burns has been looking significantly better, and it once again led the way as the Sharks' best defensive pairing of the night. When it comes to the second defensive pairing, I do want to especially talk about Erik Carlson. Once again, his major weakness was on display here tonight on the Trevor Lewis goal for the Flames. This is something I've mentioned time and time again when it comes to Carlson. For whatever reason, he consistently gets beat wide, and that's exactly what happens here. Trevor Lewis basically just skates around him. Carlson can't really keep up and turn in an efficient manner, so Lewis is able to get around him, stuff the puck in, and obviously this is probably a puck that James Reimer should make this save on, and Reimer, while he was upset, there didn't actually end up being any sort of goaltender interference or even a challenge on this particular goal, so Reimer definitely should have had it, but still, it's also a play that probably shouldn't have even materialized if Erik Carlson could somehow shore up this particular weakness of his. And while there were some nice offensive plays from him in general, there were still a couple of giveaways that make me think that A, he hasn't really gotten back to being a solid defenseman on the right side compared to, on the left side a few games ago where he really had this excuse to be making these types of giveaways. And second, he also, or B, I don't remember which one I was saying, but B, he also hasn't really gotten that much chemistry with Mario Ferraro. It basically seems as though the Sharks have two different defensemen on the ice at the same time. Like, they're not at all, there's no cohesion between them. It's basically just two independent players. It reminds me of the criticisms that I was levying towards the Tomas Hertl line earlier this season when I believe he was playing with Barabanov and Balcers. That was a line that was just like three different players trying to do their own thing. If that's exactly what it feels like when it comes to Carlson and Ferraro. And finally, the third defensive pairing, not that much of a surprise that Merkley would get pulled out of the lineup and that Milosh would end up getting pushed in, but once again, a Vlasic-Milosh pairing just doesn't really work all that well, especially against such a fast and skilled team like the Calgary Flames. They were pretty much just abused in their own zone, and there isn't really much else to say about that. And finally, when it comes to the goaltending, James Reimer had a pretty good game, I guess, but it was a very James Reimer style of game. Like I've mentioned a couple of times already this season, Reimer is the type of goalie who will make 15 straight high danger saves. I believe he has, at least he did at a point maybe a few weeks ago. I don't know if that's still exactly the case, but he's definitely right up there in terms of penalty killing save percentage. Very, very impressive. And then suddenly it'll just be a basic shot coming out from not that far out with zero screen in front, and he'll just kind of let it in, and that's exactly what ends up happening on this third goal for the Flames by Lindholm. And then of course there was the, I would say, weak one by Trevor Lewis as well. So generally, there were a lot of very good saves by Reimer, but also a lot of, a couple of those missed opportunities. It should also be noted that Reimer did leave the game with an injury about, at some point during the third period, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm not remembering incorrectly, and Capo Kakinen stepped in. Kakinen did not let in any goals, though I wouldn't say he was, facing a ton of shots against, since there wasn't that much time left in the game, and we'll see exactly how severe the Reimer injury is. It's technically a possibility that he doesn't even play for the rest of this season, considering there's only 12 games left, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see him only sit out a couple of games. Honestly, with Capo Kakinen there, it's not the end of the world that Reimer is missing time, because it's probably a good thing to get Capo Kakinen a bit more starts, even if his last one wasn't particularly strong. I think the major question at this point is what exactly is going on with Adin Hill, who has maybe played like a handful of games over the past multiple months. I don't know what's going on with him. Considering the Sharks have him on a 2-year deal, it's not the end of the world if, there really is some major underlying issue, but right now, the Sharks are kind of just running with the one goaltender if Reimer is indeed sidelined for a bit. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will face off against the Vancouver Canucks. The Canucks aren't necessarily still fighting for a playoff spot, so this isn't necessarily going to be a game that has a lot on the line. But as we approach the end of the season, you want to see certain players do well, and we'll see how it goes. Class dismissed.